Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. I'm super excited for today's episode and to welcome back Jayne Havens, who is the owner of Snooze Fest, her own sleep consulting practice, as well as the founder of Center for Pediatric Sleep Management, where she trains and mentors other sleep consultants. Jayne joined me on episode 8 as we tackled the topic of sleep training and the stigma behind it. And today we're talking all things sleep as we take on some Q&As from my Instagram. So if you haven't already, head over and follow me there, as this was such a fun episode to record, so I'm sure I'll do more Q&As over there. And as always, check out the show notes below if you want to reach out to either of us and are resonating with any of these questions and concerns that we tackle today. Enjoy the episode. I'm so excited to have you back, and even more excited because this is the first podcast episode I'll be doing that's like a Q&A styled thing, because we got so many good sleep questions. So thank you for joining me today, Jayne.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. So I figure we'll kind of just dive right into it because we've got questions a little bit all over the place here. But we can kind of just dive in. And I know a lot of this will be generalized information that we're going to give people, right? What we say may or may not help or work for your family, but that's why there's sleep coaches and information out there to connect and get the one-on-one support. But some of these are things that a lot of people struggle with. So I think it'll be good for them to hear that they're not the only one struggling with whatever they asked about.
Yeah. And that there are actual solutions. Even, I think, probably the biggest takeaway, and we'll see after we go through some of these questions, a lot of times parents will say well, I don't think that would work for my child, or I don't think my child won't, or my child can't. And, I'm a firm believer that your child can and your child will if you give them an opportunity to try. So while our advice is generalized, it's still good advice. And it still will work if you put it into action. And really the missing piece, if it's not working, as you said, is most likely accountability and support.
Absolutely. And I think that really leads us into this first question that I got, which I was just telling you about from a friend. And at first I think she was kind of jokingly saying this, but I was the most relatable thing. So I put it on the story, and I didn't put a poll up on this one. I was just this is relatable. If this is you, we can help, right? But her thing was literally keeping your savage toddler in bed at bedtime. And I think that is something that everyone was again, so relatable to, because and like you said, they're going to be oh, well, my little one won't stay in their room. If I were to leave, they would just scream for hours, or they're going to open the door and try to leave, or, in a very lot of ways, people will come and not make up excuses for their kid, but be my kid's different because XYZ. So I know that, this is stuff that we work with families with all the time. So do you have any big suggestions on what people could do if they're experiencing these kiddos just constantly getting out of bed?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite struggles to troubleshoot. And a majority of my clients have children ages 3 and up, and they are experiencing this exact struggle where bedtime is a battle. They won't stay in bed. They aren't staying in bed. And the middle of the night is lots of, coming into parents' room, either being walked back or being, a parent getting into bed with their child, a lot of shenanigans going on both at bedtime and in the middle of the night. And I actually have a program. It's called Taking Back Bedtime, the Method and the Mindset. And it would take me an hour to walk you through everything that I coach in that program. But I think the major points to highlight on this call in this conversation are to say that, like, number one, there is a method, there's step by step that you need to take, and then there's a mindset shift that needs to happen on your part
Yes.
in order to be successful. The mindset, I think, is probably where we should focus today.
Yeah.
The steps on the most basic level is like family meeting, setting your child up with new expectations, communicating the plan, role playing it, and then holding the line, right?
Right.
So, whatever that looks like, whatever your plan is, communicate it properly. Make sure that it's front and center. It's the only thing that your family is working on right now. It's your top priority, and nothing else really matters. This is what we're working on. This is what we're doing, and we're not going to stop until we resolve it. And when your
Yeah.
child sees that it's your number one priority and that you're really giving it the attention that it deserves, and you're not just trying it, or we'll see, or let's see how this goes for a night or two, and then whatever, like,
Right.
really you commit to making a change to the way your child goes to bed and falls back asleep if they rouse in the middle of the night. And really that shift in mindset where you don't um you don't subscribe to the idea that your child can't or won't.
Yep.
That just needs to go. It needs to be gone. And I always tell parents, I'm not afraid of your 3-year-old. I like to remind them, like, don't, like, no need to be afraid of your child. They're 3 or they're 4. And I tell parents that there are certain things in life that our children can be in charge of, like what color leggings they're going to wear to school today, or do they want to pack the green sippy cup or the blue sippy cup,
Right.
or do they want to fall asleep with this stuffed animal or that stuffed animal? Those are kid choices. And then there are adult choices. There are certain things that we just don't leave for our children to decide, and I think that
Right.
bedtime is one of those things. Just like your children have no say in where they go to preschool, like, you decide that for them, right?
Right.
Or if you have a nanny at home, like, your child is not deciding who your nanny is. This is an adult decision. What bedtime looks like is in the hands of the parents. And, parents will say to me, well, like, he just seems so upset about this. He's not going
Right.
to understand. And so then I love to give the example of, like, well, what if you need to replace your nanny? What happens if your nanny has a death in the family and has to go back home to her home country? Or maybe you found out something that your nanny was doing that didn't sit right with you and it was no longer a good fit for you and you had to terminate that relationship. Your child would be upset, they wouldn't understand, but it still would be the right decision for your family, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's how I see reestablishing order around bedtime and sleep as a whole, is that you just need to shift your mindset and recognize that this is an adult decision, and you're going to handle it in the way that is best for both your child and the family unit as a whole.
I think that's so true. And I think it's so funny because, like you said, you typically are supporting people like 3 and above. And I find a lot of the people that I end up supporting are like on the younger side. And some things are exactly the same. And you sharing, about, some choices are and some choices aren't theirs. And I always say to my clients, like, confidence and consistency. So, like, the same type of things, right? If we are constantly changing things, even if it's just a minor amount every day, children aren't going to know where the boundary is. They don't know where the line is. And with older kids, like, they're even smarter. They're going to be playing you even more. So definitely making the decision of what's right for your family and then sticking to it, I think is absolutely the way to go. And there's so many different ways of handling it. But yeah, I mean, some kids, yeah, they do better with choices, but these types of choices at that time of night just are not going to end well. So,
I love to remind parents, like, your 3-year-old never touches the knobs on the stove, right? Like, they don't play with the knobs on the stove because they know that they could catch on fire, right?
right.
Like, they know that that is a hard line. There
Yep.
is no wiggle room there. It's super dangerous, right? And so I view boundaries around sleep to be similar. Sleep deprivation is actually incredibly bad for our health. It's bordering on dangerous. It can
Right.
be dangerous for adults who are driving cars,
Absolutely.
who are performing surgery. Like, there are all sorts
Right.
of situations where sleep deprivation is actually really dangerous, and we need to treat it as such. And if we really put firm boundaries around what sleep looks like, it's actually super simple to resolve.
Exactly. I love that. And I think that, like, in that age range, that kind of connects us to a couple of the other questions that were in here too. And we'll kind of say, I guess we'll stay with the older, like toddler theme here, which is someone else asked if we have suggestions on transitioning from cribs to toddler beds, which often also create that bit of like another boundary and another now they have free reign, which can create a similar like in and out of bed situation. So, is there anything specific that you typically suggest to your families when they're doing this transition?
Yeah, so the first piece of advice is to wait as long as possible.
Yeah.
I will often hear parents say, we have a new baby coming. We're going to put our 2-year-old in a bed. We think he's ready. No, your 2-year-old is not ready to be in a bed if he's sleeping beautifully in his crib just because he has a baby coming into the house. That is
Right.
not a good reason to put a 2-year-old into a bed.
And it's
Of
also
course,
not a good time frame either, is what I tell
yeah.
a lot of my clients. As a postpartum doula, I hear that so much. And I'm like, it's not a good time either because now you're going to have a little one that you're up with. And now you're also going to have another kid that you may have to work with. And they may now be thinking that the baby took their crib. So, like, it's not a good vibe.
Yeah, it's not a good time, and it's unnecessary. And I hear a lot of parents say, I don't want to buy another crib. To me, that's crazy. To me, that's crazy. With what parents spend on gear for their children, the $800 stroller, the $150 changing table that's like a smart changing table. Like,
Yeah.
parents are buying like the craziest of things. Like, go on your buy nothing group in Facebook or go to IKEA and get yourself a $150 crib,
Yep.
and or get yourself a pack and play from a friend who's not using it
Exactly.
anymore. Like, everybody has a piece of equipment that they're willing to share with somebody else. Like, just
Right.
grab yourself another piece of equipment, cheap or free,
And so
and
many
keep your
people normally
child in a crib.
Yes, and so many people normally get bassinets for their little ones anyway, and I'm like, you're typically in that for 6 months, and then even if you go to a pack and play, like you have more time in it.
Yeah. So I
So
think I
totally.
think transitioning because there's another baby coming is not a good reason. Generally speaking, I always say that as long as your child is thriving in their crib, they should stay. Both of my kids were in cribs until they were 4. My son was just under 4. My daughter was like 4 and several months. And really the only reason we switched her to a bed is because this is a funny story. She came home from school one day mortified to learn that all of her friends were in beds. I guess
Oh
they
my
were all
God.
talking about what their rooms looked like. And she came home, this little 4-year-old, Mom, I'm so embarrassed. I'm the only one that still sleeps in a crib.
Oh.
And so then I thought, okay, like she's mortified. I need to do something about this. But still, even in that circumstance, then it was like I needed to order something online and they had to upholster it and it took time. So there was still
Yeah,
a delay and it bought me several more months just letting her know that the bed was on order. But really, as long as your child is sleeping well in their crib, they should stay.
right,
The crib manufacturers have like height limits on children being out of the crib after a certain amount of time. And I think that safety advice is nuanced because really that height requirement is to protect the crib manufacturers from getting sued, right? Like if
right,
a child flips over accidentally, but you also have to consider the dangers of your child having free reign of your entire home, which can be far more dangerous for a child who's not even trying to climb out of the crib, right?
right,
So it's a little nuanced. I think you need to weigh all of the safety concerns. Is the child's bedroom on a top floor? Are the stairs properly gated? Are there things within walking distance? Is it a ranch and your child's on a main level with the kitchen and they could grab a dangerous tool in the middle of the night? Like, there's so many things that you have to weigh that
right,
I think could be far more dangerous than like your child being too tall for the crib when they're not even trying to get out. They just get
right,
in, lie down, and go to sleep.
right. So now let's say that people either their kiddo is just older and sized out of it, or what I hear a lot is like 18-month, 2-year olds learning to climb like little monkeys up the walls of these cribs.
Yeah.
So say we're in
Yeah.
like a danger situation, right? Where like kiddos are climbing. I guess my first question is if they're super little and they're climbing, and we're talking about, like 18 months to 2.5, are we taking them? Do you typically suggest taking them out of the crib at that point just because they
Yeah.
are a danger?
Yeah, if they're climbing out and it's dangerous, then absolutely they need to be out of the crib and the room needs to be child proofed. And essentially we're turning the room into a crib. We're putting
Right.
a low profile bed in the room or a mattress on the floor, and we're taking out lamps and bookcases that can be toppled over and anything that could be a danger to your
Right.
child if they're really young. Um, but if they're not climbing out, then they should stay. And the
Right.
other thing that I think comes up that I think is worth mentioning is potty training. A lot of times parents will say to me, like, we transitioned our 2-year-old to a bed because they were potty training, which is a huge mistake because 2-year-olds cannot use the potty by themselves. Most of them, like, they need
Right.
help even getting on and off of the toilet. They need help getting their pants down, getting their pants up, making sure they wash their hands properly. They really need support for a
Yeah.
while. So the idea that, like, you should just give them free rein and let them in and out of bed so that they can use the potty is sort of backwards, because they're going to need help in the bathroom anyway. So let them be in the crib, let them say, mommy, I need to go to the potty. You go grab them, you take them out, you take them to the potty, you put them back in the crib.
Right. Right. Um, Okay, so now they're older or they're becoming a danger and they're time to move into a bed and we're moving them. Are there any things that you suggest from the start? I know that in older kiddos, it's really great to like sit down, have a conversation so that there's like, again, boundaries set up. But when we're talking about like littler ones, you can try and do that, but sometimes if they are really little, that's more difficult. So do you have any
Yeah.
other suggestions that you typically tell
So
families?
I actually think communication is really effective, even with children who do not have expressive language capabilities yet. Receptive language comes in really pretty early.
Yeah,
And especially for first time parents, I see them undermining their child's ability to understand. And therefore, they're not even explaining it. I think with a 16-month-old, a 17-month-old, an 18-month-old, you can sit down and have a family meeting and give them a brief outline of the expectation and what is safe and what is dangerous, when they are in their bed, what they're to do: lie down, close their eyes, take deep breaths. You can take them into their room and practice this and have and cheer for them or offer them little treats or prizes when they do a good job to reinforce that behavior. It's absolutely worth communicating, even if you think your child isn't going to understand, because in my experience, a lot of the time they do. And then, for super little kids, again, it may require a gate at the door or a child-proof safety knob cover on their doorknob. A lot of parents have really negative feelings about locking the door to their child's room. They feel that that's dangerous. If you talk to any child safety expert, firefighters, they will all tell you that it's safest if the child is in the room and cannot get out in the case of a fire or anything like that. The door closed protects fire from spreading. It actually also protects you from not knowing where your child is, right? Like, if God
right.
forbid there's a fire in your house and your child is running around the house and you don't know where they are, that actually delays you getting to them and helping them to be safe. So, there's a lot of negativity around the idea of putting a safety knob cover on your child's doorknob, but if your child does not have the impulse control to stay in their crib, then creating a firm and physical boundary for them to stay in their room, I think that there's no harm in that.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think that sometimes that can help littler children, to be able to like physically see that boundary too, which can be really helpful. And it's like for older kiddos when they're kind of drowsy and half asleep, it's like that reminder for them too. And I think that that can be really helpful for some children to physically see, try to get up. Oh, wait, there's that on the knob. I'm going to go back to sleep. It helps a lot with that independence sometimes.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that. I actually just finished up with a little 3-year-old that was really having a hard time with his own impulse control. Like, it was almost like he was on autopilot, and
Hmm.
he understood when we would speak to him, we would role play, he totally understood. And then when it came time for bedtime or middle of the night, it was just like he couldn't stay put.
Yeah.
And we did end up putting a little childproof knob cover on his door so that he would just stay in his room. And literally, that's all he needed. It was like he just needed a reminder that, oh
Right.
wait, this is a firm boundary. And he wasn't really hearing or accepting his parents' word as a firm boundary. And I could go into a whole host of reasons why that was happening, because they weren't really setting firm boundaries in any other area of his life. So he wasn't accustomed to seeing a boundary from his parents. So when they
Right.
tried to hold one at bedtime, it wasn't working, as they like to say. And that's because they hadn't earned his respect. And so when we put up a physical boundary, he was fine with it, and he didn't even really fight it too hard because he just understood it. and
Absolutely.
and he really thrived once we did that.
Absolutely. All right, let's see. One of someone was actually asking about potty training at night, which is so funny that you brought that up. So that's perfect. Kind of like touched upon that one too. And then I think the last like older children question here is asking, how do you drop the last nap and transition to doing like a quiet time in their crib, rather than like a nap time?
Yeah, so I am not a stickler for the quiet time in the crib. For me, like, when a child is dropping their nap, they really they're dropping their nap because they're just not tired enough. Like, that's why they're dropping their nap. Like, they're
Right.
not that tired at that time. And so putting them in their crib, to them, I think it almost feels like a punishment. Like, why am I in here? I'm not tired. Like, don't make me go to sleep right now. And then what happens is it becomes a power struggle that's not restful. And a 3-year old who's dropping their nap actually needs rest in the middle of the day. They need downtime. They need to be physically still, and they need to be relaxing and not using all their energy. And so when you put a child who's not tired, who doesn't want to nap, into a crib, they start screaming and yelling, and that is the opposite of rest time, right?
Right.
So I am not a firm believer that rest time or quiet time needs to happen in the crib. I think that it can happen in their bedroom with a bunch of toys. It can happen on the couch, either watching a little bit of TV or listening to an audiobook, or having a parent read to them. I think it can happen in the stroller. It can be a walk around the neighborhood. It can be a car ride. There's so many ways for a child to get downtime and rest in the middle of the day. And this is hard on parents, because parents for a few years are used to that nap right in the middle of the day. They're
Right.
used to that 2 hour break. And really, this is an adjustment for both the child and the parents. And I think parents need to recalibrate their expectations of what their day is going to look like with their child.
Right.
My kids are now 11 and 7. I don't get a nap time in the middle of the day.
Wouldn't it be great?
Um, and so it's really a time for parents to, as I said, recalibrate their own expectations, and just to evolve along with their child, and make peace with the fact that it's going to look different. And I think that that's really how it ends up going the best, is if you're not fighting each other about them not being tired and you not wanting to play with them. It's like, it's too hard.
Yeah.
One way or another, they need a space to calm down. And I don't think it needs to be them in a dark room alone in their crib when they're not tired enough to sleep.
I think it's so funny because I never thought of it that way, but that makes absolute sense. Like, and when you were saying that, it even made me start thinking about, how people say if you're having a hard time sleeping at night to adults, you'll often hear people say, like, oh, well, like sleeping, like the bed should only be for sleep, right? Like, try not to watch TV in bed or scroll your phone in bed because then your body's going to associate it with other things. And so when you were talking about that, it made me think too, if your kiddo is being put in their crib for their quiet time with different activities and things, it may be hard for their body and their brain to understand the difference between like when they're supposed to be in there for bedtime, right? So like if they're putting them in there
Yeah,
later, they might fight that a little bit more.
yeah, and look, like, if it works for your child to go into their crib and sit in a dark room for an hour or an hour and a half and not sleep and not do anything else, or if it works for you to put toys in their crib and leave the light on and just say, we're going to have an hour of you just playing in your crib by yourself, if that works, then like, great. But if it doesn't, I don't think it's worth the power struggle to
Yeah,
have your child, who's exhausted but not quite exhausted enough to fall asleep, to then be fighting you in the time when they're supposed to be resting.
absolutely. Absolutely. And there's so many different like audio book toy things out there now for children too. And I think that even like you said, like the walks or a car ride, there's so many options for being able to have some like afternoon downtime.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's pivot to like youngers because I got a handful of questions on that as well too. Um, I guess we can start with our littlest here, which would be someone was asking how to transition out of the swaddle if we had suggestions on that, and how to also address nursing to sleep associations.
Yeah. So out of the swaddle and addressing nursing to sleep are kind of actually both exactly the same, right? It's like a baby who has a preference to sleep one way, and then we're giving them an opportunity to try and sleep another way,
Right,
right? So it's sort of the same. The swaddle thing is a little tricky because for babies, you're actually up against the Moro reflex, which
right.
is an involuntary movement. And I always say, like, you can't really like sleep train away the Moro reflex. Like if they
Yeah,
have it, then it's getting in the way. Um, I I like the Merlin suit. That is my preference for transitioning out of the swaddle. Some people will say like, oh, the Merlin suit is, weighted. It's not. They'll say it limits motion. It does, and that's why when you're not in the Merlin suit, you got to have your baby on the floor doing floor time both on their back and on their belly to really strengthen those core muscles. It does make them really comfortable on their backs, but that is the safest place for them to sleep. So I'm not against that. But a lot of babies need a transitional product, either a Merlin or a Zippity Zip, or Halo now makes a sleep sack called the Easy Transition Sleep Sack, which provides a little bit of support to muffle that Moro reflex. Any way you look at it, like adjustments and changes are hard,
totally.
but they're not too hard. I think that it can be done, and it might feel hard in the moment, but that never changes in parenting. Like my 11-year-old is playing lacrosse for the first time, and it's hard for him because all the other kids have been playing lacrosse for years, and so he's not as good at it, and that feels hard, and he doesn't believe that he can do it, and right, like
Right.
it never changes. It's
I know,
always
even
the
adulthood,
same.
right?
Yeah, it never changes. So, coming out of the swaddle, you want to make sure that your baby is positioned for success. And if they're still really young and they're not rolling over from their back to their belly, then giving them some extra support from a transitional sleep suit, I think, is really wise. When transitioning away from nursing to sleep, I think it's most helpful if you have a spouse who is like the non-nursing parent to take the lead on helping to make this transition, because babies know where their food comes from.
Right.
And so if the other parent, if there is another parent, can take the lead, if not, having a postpartum doula or a friend come in and help, I think that that's really helpful. And you can literally just start by rocking to sleep, and then holding to sleep without motion, and then eventually putting the baby down completely awake. And those intermediary steps of like rocking to sleep first or holding to sleep second, those are optional steps. Like, for a baby who is used to nursing to sleep, you actually can just put them down and give them some time to get themselves to sleep.
Right.
And they might be upset about it, and that's okay. We can hold space for those big feelings, and we can support them and comfort them when necessary. But all babies, I firmly believe, are capable of learning to fall asleep in a new way. And nursing is just a preference. That's what
Right.
they've known, and that's what you've done for however many months. And it can be changed when you feel ready to make a change. I also think it's
Absolutely.
worth saying that, like, if nursing to sleep is working for you, then more power to you. Like,
Right.
no need to change what's working. And if at any point it feels like it's not working, then it's always possible to make a change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's also just like if you do like doing it, and it's one of the little changes that I suggest to a lot of my postpartum clients is like, if it's possible, try feeding upon wake up. And then that way, when they are going to sleep, it's not nursing to sleep. Maybe it's just holding or rocking, or maybe you are able to just put them down. If they're content, trying to put them down and see how they do for 5 or 10 minutes. And then if they're not falling asleep, then you help them, right? Or whatever it may be. But I think that reordering it can sometimes help a little bit as well because who wouldn't want to fall asleep all snuggled up on mom, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a really good point. I also think it's worth mentioning that for nursing parents, there's always this worry in the back of their mind that like their baby's hungry,
Right,
right? Like, when you're feeding your baby from a bottle, you can see what they're consuming, and you can see over the course of the day how much they're getting. And I think for parents of bottle fed babies, there's just a higher level of security around their baby being fed enough. And so with nursing, I agree, moving nursing to the front of the routine when they first wake up rather than going to sleep is valuable. But a lot of parents will still be really anxious about putting their baby down without feeding before a nap. And I would say that for a mom or a parent who's nursing, giving them you have my blessing to nurse before nap, as long as you're not nursing to sleep, and really feeling confident that your baby, if they're crying, it's just because they're frustrated that they're not asleep, not because they're hungry.
Exactly.
When you have a parent who's really worried about uh, the potential for hunger, when it's really just exhaustion, you don't want to confuse those things. So, I always like to give mom my blessing. Like, it's okay to feed if you're worried that your baby's hungry. Just let's make sure to put them down awake afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've got two more here. This one is asking, and I know she has a little one who just turned 1, so I'm assuming she's talking about youngins too, but I guess this applies to all ages. She was wondering how to deal with early wake up. She said 4 a.m.
So 4 a.m. is not an early wake up. 4 a.m. is the middle of the night. And so if your baby is waking up or your child is waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, that's the middle of the night. Like, we're not starting the day at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? Like,
Right.
that needs to be handled with whatever sleep training technique or whatever boundary or loving limit that you are prepared to set. But starting the day at 4 a.m. is not, like, your baby doesn't want to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Your toddler, your preschooler, your big kid, nobody wants to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So if they're up, they really just wish they were asleep, and they either lack confidence to get themselves back to sleep. 4 o'clock is not the
Yeah,
morning.
yeah,
5 o'clock, maybe. And so if your child is up at 5 o'clock in the morning, most likely they're still also too tired to be up, and we want to hold the boundary the same way. There's definitely a slight chance that the schedule is off, though. And if your
yeah,
child is getting too much daytime sleep or going to bed too early, that could definitely lead to a 5 a.m. wake up. I know
absolutely.
we're talking about littles, but to give you a common example that I come up against in my business is I often get calls from parents of 2-year-olds who are taking a 2-hour nap during the day,
Yep.
and they're going to bed at 6:45 or 7, and they're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
And the answer to that question is that, like, a 2-year-old really only needs 12 hours of sleep in a 24-hour
they're
period.
not
So
tired.
they're not tired. If they're sleeping 7 to 5 and taking a 2-hour nap, that's all the sleep that they need. And a lot of parents of 2-year-olds, they're really hooked on that 7 to 7 that they thought was going to live forever.
Yeah,
And my 11-year-old goes to bed like after 9 o'clock. Like, as your kid gets older, they want to stay up later. And part of your toddler growing into a preschooler is, like, if they're still going to sleep during the day, then 7 o'clock bedtime is no longer appropriate. They need to
right,
sleep like 8 to 6 or 8:30 to 6:30 with a two
right.
hour nap. And that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of parents who really got used to that 7 to 7.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that even connects to the last question, which this mama has younger kiddos as well, but it relates exactly to I find, especially when I was in the daycare world, seeing preschool and toddler age kiddos, but school naps versus home naps, right? Because these 2-year-olds are often napping at school for 2 hours, but then maybe at home they're not because they're not worked out, they're not exhausted enough at the middle of the day. So I guess in that situation, my own question that I could bring up in relation to that is if kiddos are napping at school, is it so bad to be having them sleep and go to bed later at night versus on the weekends, maybe going to bed earlier? And is it worth telling the daycare to not have your kid nap? Because we used to have a lot of parents say that as well.
Yeah. So I think that for children who are napping at daycare but not napping at home, you're right on the money. Like, weeknights, they need to go to bed later because they're not tired if they took
Right.
a 2.5 hour nap at daycare. They definitely need to have a later bedtime during the week. And on the weekends, if they're not going to nap, then they can go to bed earlier. I have no problem with that. To answer your question about whether parents should be telling daycare not to nap their kiddos, I think by like 3.5, that's a fair conversation.
Yeah.
When parents of like 2-year-olds are telling daycare not to have their child nap, I feel like that's really not fair.
It's
2-year-olds are 2-year-olds need to nap during the day. And really what's going on is parents are not doing their job at home by setting reasonable expectations and boundaries around what sleep looks like at home. So they're not getting the sleep that they need at home. Bedtime is a disaster. They're up all night. And then they're tired during the day at daycare and they crash. And,
Yeah.
it's not fair to daycare to have to keep them up all day when they're zombies,
Yeah.
right? So I think that there's a certain situation by like 3.5, close to four, like 4 year olds, when parents tell me like my 4 year old's in daycare and he still naps there because like all the other kids nap and peer pressure and it's really messing with bedtime. By 4 years old, even 3.5, I am of the camp that like if it's really messing up nighttime sleep, it's worth it to talk to the pediatrician, get a doctor's note, and really explain to them that it is not in this child's well-being to be napping for 2 hours during the day at 4 years old.
Yeah. And I used to oversee a pretty large daycare. And so I would often cover like lunch breaks and all these different rooms during these nap times. And you see it. Some kiddos absolutely wide awake, starting in toddler classrooms. But some of the kids, I know we had some in preschool and young pre-K kids that parents would say, like, oh, like, let's not nap them. Like, let's give them books or things to read on their cots. And some of them would do great with that. And some of them were just exhausted. And whether that be because bedtime's a struggle at home or they're just so overstimulated and exhausted from the interaction of being in a classroom all day. Like that's a lot to go on for a little kid. Like it's
Yeah,
overstimulating.
absolutely. And every situation is unique. And the advice I'm giving, at least here, is not blanket advice, right? Like when I work with 4 year olds in my sleep consulting practice who are still napping at daycare, a lot of the time what I'll say to them is like, okay, well, let's start with Saturday and Sunday together so that we can get
Yeah,
2 good nights under our belt. And if they get good nights of sleep under their belt before they can go back to school on Monday, maybe they actually won't nap at daycare
right.
because they will have gotten a full night of sleep. And then we can sort of ride that positive wave where like they don't need to nap. They're not falling on their faces at daycare, but that's because they're getting a good night of sleep at home. And it can be like a chicken and egg scenario where like, the nap at daycare is really making overnight sleep hard. And I think everybody really needs to work together in these situations. Parents, daycare, pediatricians, everybody needs to be on the same page.
Absolutely. And then I guess that kind of tags us into like the second half of that question, which is our last part here is, what about our infants? Because we know in a lot of states coming from an infant and daycare background, children aren't all sleeping at the same time because they're following their own routines. So the lights are on, it's bright. Children aren't getting that typical sleep space they're getting at home. And I know that's really anxiety provoking, especially for families that are sending their kids to daycare for the first time, being like, my kid only naps in the dark sound machined room. What the heck are they going to do? Do you have suggestions or input for those families that are in that situation, or if they're already in daycare and they have little ones and the little ones are not napping well at all? What do we
Yeah.
do about that?
Yeah. So this is something I really connect with and identify with because I was always a stay-at-home mom with my kids in a dark room with a sound machine. And
Right.
so the thought of putting an infant in a bright room with those like, industrial fluorescent
The
lights and
lights.
all the
Yeah.
all the noise and people talking and babies crying and kids are supposed to nap in that environment. I just never understood it and I still don't. So it's not that I have advice for like better napping in those scenarios. My advice is more for the parents that like you chose to put your child in daycare and there are pros and cons to this type of childcare environment, just as there are pros and cons to staying home. There are pros and cons to having a nanny or a nanny share and the socialization that I always talk to parents like there's so many amazing things about daycare, right? Like your child's going to be exposed to socialization, they're going to get music, they're going to get gym, they're going to get learning how to share, they're going to watch other kids eat. Like there's
Yeah.
so many things that are amazing about daycare. And this is like the one thing that kind of is a bummer. This
Yeah.
and the fact that your kid's going to get sick all the time, right? Like those
Right.
are the two downsides of daycare. And I think that you just sort of have to make peace with it and realize like this is daycare's problem. Like if your baby is not napping well all day, like they're the ones that have to deal with that. And you're going to come home and maybe they're going to nap on the car ride on the way home or get a quick cat nap. You're going to feed them, throw them in the bath and give them a bottle or breastfeed and put them to bed. And it's a short season.
Yeah.
This is not forever. And I just try to help parents realize all the amazing things about daycare, to help them realize, like, this is one thing that kind of sucks. Nobody wants to hear that their baby's taking crummy naps. But rather than trying to micromanage daycare or control the situation when realistically you probably can't, I think it just makes sense to remember all the reasons for why you chose it and just accept that there are a lot of incredible things about daycare, and your child is lucky to have these experiences, and you take the good with the bad, and it will all, in a couple of years your kid's not going to be napping anyway, and it's fine.
Right, right. And I think that's so true because I get asked that all the time because I was that infant teacher with 7 crying babies and 4 that won't nap, right? But the thing that I also say too is that a lot of the times people will be like, oh, my kid's a horrible napper. But by the time they come to daycare after a couple of weeks, they get used to the sounds and the lights, which is crazy. And a lot of the time they become so worked up and tired from like doing things and interacting and playing that sometimes they just knock out. And sometimes, and I should say, a majority of the times, those kiddos end up napping for that, 20, 30-minute, 45-minute, one cycle nap, but they're at least getting the rest in, right? So they may nap more often or shorter at school. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's a short season. It's not like it's going to be like that forever. And I often find the second they get to toddlers is when the lights get to turn off and they do so much better with that one long midday nap. And so, yeah, I think that's such great advice of like, yeah, just remember all the good things too.
I think moms have so much guilt around all decisions revolving around working and raising children at the same time.
Yes.
And I see this so much in my work, that parents have so much guilt around sending their kids to daycare or having a nanny or whatever it may be. And I just see it as like, in so many ways, it's wonderful. And let's stop making ourselves feel like garbage all the time, and really try to just accept the fact that we're doing the best that we can, and we're giving our children opportunities for enrichment and learning and growth and socialization, and it's all going to be okay.
I love that. I think that's such good advice to end our little episode here with. So thank you. It was so fun gathering all those questions and getting a chance to like answer a little bit of everything for everyone. So I appreciate you joining me, and I'm sure you'll be back another time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.